end. So I'm going to hand over now to Jed. Ged Pope is a writer, researcher, teacher. He currently teaches London history and culture to American students at Kappa Global Education in South Ken, and he's written numerous books about London culture and about the suburbs. And his latest book, and this is the reason we asked him to do this evening's talk, it's got the wonderful title, All the Tiny Moments Blazing, and it's a literary guide to suburban London. We have a copy of that which we will be reviewing shortly, so we will get that onto the website as well, and hopefully Jed will show you a copy of the book during the talk. It is, of course, as they say, available at all good bookshops, so published by Reaction Books, so all good bookshops, all the famous online ones, and it will make an ideal present for Christmas, which we're slightly scared to realize is only 2 weeks away. So thank you very much. That's enough from me. I will now hand you over to Jed.
Okay, thank you very much, Don. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. So I'm afraid there's no Christmas elements in this talk. I should have put some Christmassy things in, but I didn't think of it actually. So my talk today, quite obviously, is going to be about the London suburbs, specifically the ways in which suburbs have been imagined and represented in fictional work. And our title for today, What Kind of a Place Is This?, comes from a great novel by Zadie Smith called White Teeth that came out in 2000. And this particular episode concerns one of the characters, Clara, who's trying to develop a new life, to find a new life. She escapes her old life in Lambeth and escapes off to the brave new world of Willesden Green. And she turns up in Willesden in the back of a van, and she looks around and she's really confused. And she says, what kind of place was this? That was the thing you could see, but you couldn't be sure. Traveling in the front passenger seat of the van, she'd seen the high road, and it'd been poor and ugly and familiar, though there were no kingdom halls or Episcopalian churches. But then at the turn of the corner, suddenly the roads exploded into greenery, beautiful oaks. The houses got taller, wider, and more detached. She could see parks, she could see libraries, and then abruptly the trees would be gone, reverting back into bus stops, as if by the stroke of some midnight bell. So she's not quite sure what to make of this northwest London suburban terrain. It just won't come into focus for her. It's confusing and frightening and a complete mess. It lacks any clear indicators of place, and at the end she decides it's somewhere between the trees and the shit. So she kind of looks at both sides of the suburban spectrum now. So Clara's not alone in this. This is a very common theme in lots of suburban writing. So I want to talk tonight about how the London suburbs have long suffered from this kind of identity crisis. Generations of commentators and historians and urbanists are not sure what the suburbs are or what to make of them. And this really does include fiction as well. So the literary and creative reaction to suburbia, it's a really fascinating story. And there are many different versions of the London suburbs. We're going to explore some of them today. In many instances, of course, the suburbs are totally ignored or denigrated. It can be quite hard to find interesting representations of the London suburb. It's quite hard to dig out interesting texts in this area because for many decades, for 150 years really, the suburbs have been considered to be monotonous, the tiresome, toiling lower middle classes, all those city clerks, tradesmen, skilled workers. Nothing much has ever happened, nothing happens, not the big human stories anyway. So tonight I want to try and explore what the most common reactions to the suburbs have been over the last 150 years or so. I kind of narrowed it down to 4 main areas. So the first one we're going to look at is this idea of paradise destroyed. This is the idea that originally the area around London was beautiful and bucolic, and it was destroyed by this kind of encroachment of the mass suburbia around 1840, 1850, trampling through pristine countryside. And then the second theme I want to look at is this idea of progress paused. So this is a very common theme in lots of suburban writing. This is the idea of the suburb as the place where nothing happens, or if things do happen, they tend to be tedious and domestic and not really worth worrying about too much. And the third main kind of suburban theme that's gone through much writing over the last 150 years or so is the idea of paradise regained. This is the idea that the suburb is actually a restoration of a pastoral idyll, achieving this ideal of the Ruskin herb, the country in the city. And there's quite a few novels which are like romances of the suburbs, which show people living in a kind of, in a roughly pastoralized reality. And the last one I want to look at is the idea of the suburb as a dreamscape. So this is the suburb as highly malleable, highly changeable. Because the suburb somehow eludes precise definition, that's one of the advantages. It can be a liberating strength. It can give writers a freedom to create and to start anew. So the first one, like I say, is going to be this idea of paradise destroyed. So clearly the outside the immediate urban area and up till the 18th century, the countryside around London was precisely that: countryside, meadows, streams, rivers, fields, market gardens, farms and orchards. And we have some great descriptions of the London Periphery. For example, on the left here, you can see Isaac Walton, who wrote his famous novel, his famous guide to fishing, The Complete Angler. Weirdly enough, Isaac Walton's favorite river was the River Lee at Tottenham, and he writes very beautifully about the sort of Tottenham countryside before it was built over. He talks about a sweet, shady ardor which nature has woven with her own fine fingers. And then moving across here, Clapham again. Clapham is considered to be a very beautiful place. Lots of people retired to Clapham. Clapham is considered to be the first kind of suburb in the sense of a desirable retreat away from the cares of the city. Samuel Pepys resigned to Clapham after moving from the city in the 17th century. William Blake was another visitor to the London kind of peripheral countryside, and there's a famous story in the Gilchrist biography of William Blake walking down to Peckham from Soho, and he actually makes it as far as Peckham Rye, which is about probably about 5 or 6 miles, and he sees famously sees a vision of angels in a tree on Peckham Rye. And here's a mural of that incident, of that episode, which is now on the side of a house in Peckham, just down the road from where I am. Other writers: Mary Shelley finds delightful lawny uplands. Robert Browning walks for hours in woods near Dulwich. Leigh Hunt, also around the 1820s, spends a weekend. He has a weekend break in Dulwich at the Greyhound pub in Dulwich. He says, feeling as if he had newly got into the country. Charles and Mary Lamb escape is in turn for the delights of Enfield. So there are lots of descriptions of how beautiful the countryside is around London, but we know it can't last. So very soon the suburbs' rural character is destroyed by the arrival of unmade roads, filthy ditches, grotty fences, brick fields, building materials, mounds of rubble and rubbish, by endless developments going on in people's backyards. And some examples of this idea of the paradise destroyed, well, one example is in John Ruskin. So John Ruskin was born in a huge house in Herne Hill, which is in South London, just south of Camberwell, about a mile south of Camberwell. He was born at 28 Herne Hill. Then he moved further into London. He moved up the hill to 163 Denmark Hill, which is the house here. None of these houses survive, unfortunately. He moved to this house in 1847, and he thought it was paradise, and he has lots of ecstatic boyhood wanderings through the countryside. And this is one episode. He says he looks out of the back garden and he can see 7 acres of healthy ground, meadows sloping to the sunrise, the breast prudently and pleasantly divided into an upper and a lower kitchen garden. He says there's a fruitful bit of orchard. There's even a rivulet, boasting little of its brightness, for there he springs at Dulwich. So it's all very beautiful. And he goes for a walk along Croxted Lane, which is now part of Dulwich village. And he says it's a green byroad with primroses, archangels, daisies, plenty, and purple thistles in autumn. So you can see he thinks it's absolutely beautiful, but you know it can't last. So up the hill comes the suburbs from Brixton, from Camberwell, from Peckham. Here comes what Ruskin calls that great foul city of London, rattling, growling, smoking, stinking, a ghastly heap of fuming brickwork pouring out poison at every pore. So what happens to Croxted Lane when the suburbs arrive? Oh dear. So he says, it's the lane is bordered on each side by Hades only knows what. mixed dust of everything unclean, ashes and rags and beer bottles and old shoes, battered pans and smashed crockery, kitchen garbage, back garden sewage, old iron, cinders, bone and ordure of indescribable bits of stinking dust and mortal slime. So you can see he's not happy about the arrival of the suburbs on his doorstep in South London. And he was particularly angry about the arrival of the Crystal Palace, which is this top picture on over the right here. These are the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, which are still there. I have to tell you, they're not quite that dramatic when you see them in real life. He was really disgusted by the Crystal Palace, which had moved from Hyde Park and moved to a big hill in Sydenham near to Ruskin in 1852. And he really hates all the day trippers turning up on the special trains who were there for the amusements and the fun fairs, there to marvel at the wonders of global engineering and culture. So this is the urban suburban edge, becomes blighted, raw, becomes a wasteland. It becomes what Dickens called an unsettled neighborhood. And there's a famous description of these unsettled neighborhoods in Our Mutual Friend from 1865, when this is Holloway, where Dickens describes this immense pile of dust. Between Battle Bridge and that part of the High District was a tract of suburban harrow, which were tiles and bricks were burnt, bones were boiled, carpets were beat, rubbish was shot, dogs were fought, and dust was heaped by contractors. So this tremendous, lots of examples of this loathing of suburban destruction around the middle to the end of the 19th century. Another great example comes in works by H.G. Wells, especially the autobiographical works. Works like The New Machiavelli, where he discusses growing up in what was then a still village in Bromley in the 1860s. He talks about how lovely little Bromley High Street was, a narrow, irregular little street of thatched houses strung along the London and Dover Road. And it's all the sort of features of a particular village high street of the mid-19th century. Then, of course, there comes that, what he calls the coming flood of mechanical power, which is like an invading army, really. Everything gets torn apart, everything's destroyed, factories, brickfields, gasworks, railways, schools. And H.G. Wells was really disgusted by this sort of annihilation of Bromley in the 1870s. Digging and wheeling of woods invaded by building, roads gashed open and littered with iron pipes, a fearful smell of gas, men peeped at and seen toiling away deep down in excavations, hedges broken, replaced by banks and wheelbarrows. As you can see, it describes it very much as a kind of war zone. And H.G. Wells never forgave them for destroying Bromley, and he never went back to Bromley, and he had a lifelong loathing of Bromley, even refusing the freedom of the town of Bromley when he was older and famous. And kind of linked to this idea of the destruction of the suburb, there's a slight kind of variation on this theme of the suburb as destructive and despoiling the wonders of nature, is this idea of the suburbs never overcoming this innate sort of squalid sense of being squalid and disastrous and destroying the natural order. And it kind of modulates into something else around the 1870s and the 1880s, which is to see the suburb as a kind of vanguard of a vulgar modern civilization, this civilization of modern mass-produced housing, mass literacy, culture, mass modern culture, newspapers, entertainment, shopping and consumerism, especially advertising. Lots of writers had it in for garish adverts around the 1880s. And all this is sort of, also contains an attack on new kinds of women and new women's roles in the suburbs in the 1880s and 90s. The new woman, which we'll discuss a little bit later. So gender roles were reversed, and women are presented in lots of these 1880s, 1890s London novels as avaricious, ambitious, who push aside their kind of meek menfolk. And this happens, interestingly, in Camberwell, which is just down the road from Ruskin's trashed Denmark Hill. Some 30 years later, George Gissing writes this novel in the year of Jubilee, which is precisely about this new suburban formation, which he sees as a horrible kind of vanguard of a new modern culture, especially the women who he thinks are, there's this group of sisters in this novel, the Peachy sisters, and he thinks they're the most worthless creatures living as one of these trashy, flashy girls. And their major crime really is they set up a mail order fashion business in Camberwell, and they give it the grand name of the South London Fashionable Dress Supply Association, like a sort of fashion club. and Gissing calls it a sort of Christmas club for ignorant and pretentious women, too weak-minded to save up their own money. And this is based on the principle that, as Gissing says, out of every 500 women, you can reckon on 499 of them being fools. So Gissing really hates the kind of new suburban formation in the 1880s and 1890s. And you see this kind of horror of suburbia right through other works in the 1880s and 1890s. So also in 1888, you have the first Sherlock Holmes novel, A Study in Scarlet, which is not set in foggy, crowded streets of Marylebone, but it's actually set out on the suburban limits to what Doyle calls elsewhere the howling desert of South London. So the first kind of crime that Sherlock Holmes is called upon to solve occurs at 3 Lauriston Gardens off the Brixton Road. He gets a message in the night saying there's been a bad business during the night, and he has to go down to South London to try and sort this out. And he has quite a tough journey getting there. The suburbs are at the outer limits here, and it's grey and it's foggy. He says there was a dun-coloured veil hung over the housetops, looking like a reflection of the mud-coloured streets beneath. Everything's muddy, everything's dirty, everything's colourless, everything's formless. And it's a real challenge to the detective's forensic skills. And he's really horrified by the suburban house, which he's really not used to this kind of terrain at all. And even the victim, who's Enoch Drebber, this guy here, who's the first kind of Sherlock Holmes victim, he's quite horrific too. He's really horrible. He's like some sort of throwback. He's some sort of evolutionary throwback. He's deformed and misshapen. Watson describes him to us as having the low forehead, blunt nose, and prognathous jaw gave the dead man a singularly simious and ape-like appearance, which was increased by his writhing, unnatural posture. So obviously the detective is kind of unhappy in the suburbs. And this sense of the suburbs as being blighted and the destroy of a natural landscape, a sense of trashing, destroying place, goes right through the whole tradition of suburban literary fiction. It goes through George Gissing, it goes through George Orwell, goes through Paul Theroux at Deptford, a novel called The Family Arsehole in the 70s, which is about how horrible South London Deptford is. But my favourite example of this kind of idea of the suburb as kind of squalid and awful is Fowler's End by Gerald Kirsch. It was written in 1957. And it's just hilarious. It's so grim. It's just so funny. So he says Fowler's End is fictional. It doesn't really exist. So you get there, Kirsch tells us, by, quote, going north to Edmonton and Ponder's End. Who Ponder was and how he ended, the merciful God knows. And then you have to go a little further, quote, to where the city gives up the game. Fowler's End is horrible. It's a great description. It says, Fowler's End is a special kind of tundra that supports the nothing gracious in the way of flora and fauna. Plant a cabbage there in this soured, embittered, dyspeptic, ulcerated soil, and up comes a kind, bleached shillelagh, spikes on its knob. Plant a family, a respectable working class family, and 2 generations, it will turn out to be wolves. Every Fowler's End is barren of everything but weeds. Even the dogs are throwbacks to their yellow-eyed predatory ancestors. Again, you get this idea of the suburbs as kind of an evolutionary dead end, throwing horrible kind of reminders of a pre-evolutionary days. So let's move on to the second theme I want to talk about, this idea of progress pause. So as well as being destructive, another common theme in lots of suburban fiction, this idea that the suburbs are the vanguard of a particular kind of modernity, the modern industrial and commercial society. This is the idea of the place embodying a kind of the place where nothing really happens, where things will come to a stop. Or if things do happen, then it's not going to be that interesting. It's going to be dull and tedious. So lots of Edwardian, Edwardian observers took this very, very seriously. They seem to see it as some kind of low point or end point of civilization, a kind of deadened, entropic full stop to civilization itself. So this kind of theme is clearly linked to ideas around wobbling imperial ideals, the end of expansion, the end of adventure, the end of struggle, of heroism, and all these kind of masculine ideals. And the most famous quote is probably from CFC Charles Masterman, who says, They are easily forgotten, for they do not strive or they do not cry, and they just want to be left alone. They are the creations not of the industrial, but of the commercial and business activities of London. So this idea of things coming to an end, an entropic end, progress pauses, exhausted is satisfied, man is made. And that's it. And if things do happen, then they're always necessarily going to be tedious and domestic and trivial, including things like raising children, having a family, commuting, eating, sleeping, shopping, gardening, all those kind of pastimes. The whole of the humdrum, platitudinous things of life. All matters are wholly and unmitigatedly suburban. So lots of suburban commentators really had it into the suburbs. And we see this a lot as well in lots of fiction of the era. So there's lots of novels and stories that address the idea of suburbia as something where nothing really happens. And this is usually done in a sort of mildly mock-mocking comic way. So just this some of these popular novelists that people didn't know about. Barry Payne, who wrote these Eliza stories where nothing really happens. I think here that Eliza finds a mushroom or something. It's not that dramatic. Jerome's 3 Men in a Boat, where they have lots of adventures on a boat, usually things like opening tins of pineapples or not being able to put up their tent, not being able to sail properly, things like that. Edward Thomas wrote a series of stories about the whirlwinds of Balaam, and again, nothing really happens. And this continues right into the 20th century with Orwell's Coming Up for Air, which again is sort of the exploits of a kind of a very sad and defeated and flattened George Bowling, who lives in the West London and really wants to escape the horror of it all. So this tradition of nothing happening goes right through suburban fiction. I've got time for one example really. So this is a great example called The Smiths of Surbiton by William Petridge, where he says, this is a comedy without a plot. So this is a kind of fiction, it's so boring, you can't even have a narrative, nothing ever happens. So you can't really have a plot because there's no development, there's no characters, there's no activities. He gives us a word warning at the beginning of the novel. A word warning. There are no people of title in this story, no epigrams, no deeds of heroism, no strangely beautiful women, no handsome men, no hairbreadth escapes. So the only workable kind of fictive mode here is light comedy. And in the Smiths of Surbiton, when you get things, each chapter has hilarious titles called things like New Year's Eve, spring cleaning, the naming of the baby, how to take care of baby. Mr. Smith muddles things. Mr. Smith is unwell. So again, to get a sense of nothing as much as happening. Again, this goes right through into Edwardian fiction. Anybody knows the M4's Howard's End. There's a famous suburban couple, Leonard and Jackie Bast, and Leonard Bast here, what he wants to read, he wants to be accepted by the middle class Schlegel and Millcourt families, but he's physically unhealthy, he's weedy, he's got a bad heart, and he eventually dies by he's killed by a falling bookcase. So this is like a great symbol of he must stay away from culture because it's not for him, it will kill him. And probably the most famous example of this kind of the idea of the suburb as a place where nothing really happens comes again from 1888 with George and William Grossmith's Diary of a Nobody, which is set in Holloway. And this is Charles Pooter on the left here. And what's interesting about this novel is that Charles Pooter is a nobody in many different ways. He's a nobody because he's invisible and he keeps being overlooked, but he's also a nobody in the sense that he's got no physical presence. He's completely incompetent. He can't fix anything. He boasts about being at home in this house here, the Laurels, Brickfield Terrace, Holloway. He's always boasting about how he can fix things, but he's useless at doing things. Everything breaks. He trips, he slips, he falls over, things get knocked over, he gets knocked over, he gets punched in the back of the head. So the whole place is in permanent chaos. And probably the best example of this is that he finds a tin of red paint. And he gets really taken by this tin of red enamel paint, and he paints everything in the house with red enamel paint. And he gets into the bath to wash it off, and the bath water comes covered in red paint, and he thinks he's bleeding to death. He's just highly incompetent and can't cope at all with this sense of controlling the environment. move on to my third subject, really, which is this idea of paradise regained. So this is another common tradition of suburban writing, which is kind of goes back to that sense of the suburb, the destroyed original Arcadia. And this is a sense of the suburb as actually putting some of that back. So obviously the appeal of the suburbs in the sort of mid-19th century was because it offers the appeal of the pastoral within the city, the illusion of the city and the country, the rust and herb, cleanliness, space, peace, safety, predictability. So as the suburbs destroy the countryside, they kind of put it back in a more picturesque way. So this becomes an aspect of the suburban dream around the middle of the century. Again, in lots of writers like Jerome K. Jerome, Henry James, Conan Doyle, G.K. Chesterton. So Arthur Conan Doyle here, as well as we noted, being aggrieved by the suburban gloom in Brixton, he actually lived down the road in very suburban West Norwood. He lived there for quite a number of years and actually loved the freedom of being out and about in the suburbs. He took up cycling and tennis and cricket, and he was interested in local societies. He wrote a really strange novel called Beyond the City, The Idyll of a Suburb by Arthur Conan Doyle, which is a sort of exploration of suburban happiness. And again, nothing much happens, but everyone's very healthy and very happy. They're very close to nature. And it's kind of like a suburban dream. As much of other novels in the 19th century, Robert Thorne's Story of a London Clerk, again presents a story of somebody who has a kind of grim job in the city but escapes to Denmark Hill again, of all places, and is surrounded by countryside and nature, and really, and it's quite an unusual story of a suburban life, which is quite happy. But the best example really of this idea of the suburb as restoring sort of a pastoral bliss and beauty is G.K. Chesterton's The Man Who Was Thursday, which was written in 1908. And this is set in Bedford Park in West London, which is a kind of proto arts and crafts, proto garden city. And he discusses it as if it's an enchanted wonderland. The suburb of Saffron Park lay on the sunset side of London, as red and ragged as a cloud of sunset. It's built of bright brick throughout, its skyline was fantastic, and in its ground plan was wild. The place was not only pleasant, but perfect. So this is the idea of suburban enchantment. And you get this in kind of a lot of other writers as well, who try to explore the suburbs and try to find this idea of beneath the suburbs, there is really the countryside. So the naturalist Richard Jefferies lived in Surbiton for a while. Edward Thomas was in pursuit of nature in Balham in South London. D.H. Lawrence was trying to explore nature around Croydon, where he lived for quite a few years. One subset of this would be the idea of the suburb itself is destroyed. So other writers recreate the destroyed pre-suburban Arcadia by projecting it into an imagined future. So again, Richard Jefferies wrote this kind of interesting proto kind of apocalyptic novel called After London in 1888. This is London's destroyed, and it kind of reverts back to a sort of, it's not beautiful, it's kind of a huge toxic sludge, but this idea of beyond the city, beyond the suburb, you can still find the beauties of nature. H.G. Wells in The Time Machine explores southwest London, Richmond and Surrey by the year 802, 701, very beautiful. They resemble Renaissance Tuscany with lots of hills, and it's very beautiful and in balance with nature. And a great example of this idea of the suburb being destroyed and nature being allowed to come back. The best example of this appears in William Morris's News from Nowhere. And this story concerns a character who goes home to Hammersmith one night a bit drunk, goes to bed, wakes up the next day. I can't believe what he sees, because he's actually slept for 100, 200 years. And Hammersmith has been restored to its pre-industrialized beauty. He just talks about how beautiful the Thames is in Hammersmith. Both shores had a line of very pretty houses, low and not large, standing back a little from the river, red brick and roof with tiles, gardens in front going down to the water's edge, in which the flowers were now blooming luxuriantly and sending delicious waves of summer scent over Edinburgh Stream. This is the idea of you can recover what's beneath the suburbs, but you have to go forward into the future in order to locate it. Finally, I just want to talk about my last theme. Really, is this idea of the suburb as some kind of strange dreamscape. So to link it with these reimagined, restored Arcadias, the suburb by dreamscape don't mean necessarily made up, but rather imagined or recreated or consciously recreated. Because the suburb is presented in various ways as being a pure fantasy, as a dreamscape that underlines how strange and excessive it is. So I remember growing up in the 1970s and 1980s, and the suburb was always presented as being weird, as being odd, as being overheated nest of snobbery and class distinction and social and sexual anxieties and excess. So all those sitcoms that we're familiar with in the 1970s, the suburb, the hope of the crank or the eccentric or the oddball or the weirdo or the sexually deviant. Or the suburbs presented as being hyper-normal, as being so weird, it's kind of strange, which you get in movies like this one, Shaun of the Dead, where it's a really funny scene at the beginning of the Shaun of the Dead where he goes to shops, the streets are plagued by zombies. He goes to the shop to get his Coke and his chocolate bar. He doesn't notice that it's actually dominated by zombies because it's normally like that anyway. I just want to talk about some variations on this theme of the suburb as dreamscape or imagined space. Obviously, J.G. Ballard, so we need to mention J.G. Ballard. I just want to talk about briefly, just to end, about J.G. Ballard, Hanif Qureshi, and Zadie Smith. So J.G. Ballard was famously a long-time resident of suburban Shepperton, an area outside his suburban Shepperton's house, and he really extols the boredom and the regularity of the suburb. He sees it as a harbinger of the future. The future is going to be boring. The suburbanization of the planet will continue, and the suburbanization of the soul will follow soon after. So he doesn't seem to be that troubled by this fate. He seems to think it's just how things are. So Ballard reverses the standard suburb centre opposition. The suburb in his work, the motorway towns, the executive estates, it's all where it's happening. They're going to be the future, not the centre, which is museumified, which is heritage, which is boring, which is dull. So you can see that Ballard has a point here. If anyone's ever been to Battersea Power Station or Elephant Park or King's Cross development, which seems so over-controlled and blandly consumerist and quite boring, really, compared to some of the more lively stuff which is going on in the former boring suburbs, like Peckham, Brixton, and Hackney. So Ballard's work really pressurizes the everyday, the boring, the daytime TV, the daytime drinking, the routine, the supermarkets, the regularity. He kind of cracks them until they kind of open up and produce all kinds of florid and weird and bizarre extremes. And the best example of this is his novel, The Unlimited Dream Company, which came out in 1977, I think, which is set in Shepperton. But it's not like the Shepperton that we imagine. The once immaculate lawns and flower beds are overrun with tropical plants, palmettos, banana trees, and glossy rubber plants jostles for space. So again, this idea of the suburb so boring it becomes abnormal. And again, there are lots of novels which present the idea of the suburb as being a place for the migrant diaspora, where this vacancy, where this lack of definition becomes quite liberating. It becomes a space for reinvention, for creativity. So these novels, almost at random, really, by V.S. Naipaul, the Mr. Stone Knight's Companion, is about a man who comes to London to reinvent himself. In the Ditch by Brooke Maketa is about somebody trying to bring up a family in Finsbury, trying to make a home in Finsbury. Lara by Bernardine Evaristo, one of her early novels, which is about a girl growing up in suburban Woolwich and trying to make sense of her new surroundings and trying to stitch things together. To get this idea of the suburb as offering space, opportunity for recreation, for self-invention. And of course, the best example of this is Hanif Qureshi's Back to Bromley, the Bromley set novel of the Buddha of Suburbia, where he says, obviously, the place is really, really boring. During the nights, all around me was silent. Most of the neighborhood went to bed at 10:30. There were no excuses to be made in the evenings. No one went out and there was nowhere to go. But then that's kind of liberating. That's presented in the Buddha of Suburbia. Probably is obviously boring and racist and horrific, but it's also this idea of you can recreate yourself, hence the famous opening, I'm an Englishman born and bred almost, a funny kind of Englishman, a new breed. So this idea of Bromley providing the sort of raw materials for a recreation of the self. So Karim, who's the main character in the novel, kind of creates his own culture. which he culls from all around, or from alternative philosophy, cult literature, the counterculture, beat poetry, and of course the emerging punk rock movement. And the irony of the novel, The Buddha of Suburbia, is that suburb is not dull. It's far from dull. It's packed with oddballs and eccentrics. There's anorexic fathers and bisexual pop stars and mystic civil servants. It's chock full of new ways of living, alternative life forms, so it's not boring at all. It gets more boring, I think, when he moves to the city and becomes full of stereotypes and cliches. And finally, I just want to talk about Zadie Smith's work, which is where we started. So in her 2000 novel White Teeth, she calls the place where she grew up the Woolsden Kaleidoscope. What kind of place is this? Which is where we started. But it's also a place of continual, exuberant self-invention, multiple narratives, discovery, world recreation. So it feels quite liberating. It gives space for histories, ethnicities, and cultures to recombine and to refashion and to redevelop themselves. And the most recent novel set in northwest London is called NW, which actually is far more pessimistic about opportunities for self-definition. The same suburbs become much more entrapping. They're closed, they're cramped, they're entrapping, claustrophobic, they're even murderous. And she repeats this refrain: "I am the sole author of the dictionary that defines me." But in the end, if you know that novel, that doesn't become true at all. Okay, so I want to finish there. These are the things that I've been reading about. So if you're interested in suburban fiction, suburban literature, probably the best book to read is Margins of Desire by Lynn Hackwood, which came out about 10 years ago, which looks at the sort of Victorian Edwardian suburb. Greater London by Nick Barrett is a history of suburban development, which is very thorough and very interesting. And my own book here is really kind of a survey of suburban narratives from about 1840 till the present day. Okay, thank you very much.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much, Jed. That was wonderful. If anyone's got any questions, do put them into the Q&A. If someone's asked while you were talking, how did you research? Presumably they're asking, have you been reading thousands and thousands of books set in the London suburbs?
Yeah. So when I first started, I thought, oh my God, this is boring because there's nothing to write about apart from Diver Nobody, maybe H.G. Wells and a few others. But once you start digging down, start exploring, and looking at databases, and once you start researching, there are lots of forgotten suburban novelists, especially from the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th century. I'd never heard of many of them; they've all been forgotten now. But once you start digging down, you do make links, and there are people were writing novels and stories set in the suburbs, which have completely disappeared. So you just look through, you look through you go to the London Library, you go to the British Library, and you do some connections there. But yeah, like I say, I was quite surprised how much stuff there was really, which is all being kind of submerged because the suburbs aren't central. It's not that kind of, it's like central London, which is very much explored and written about. You have to dig harder to find out material set in the suburbia, but it definitely is there. And more recently as well, so it's going to get easier, I think.
Yeah, I was wondering whether our sort of whether the definition of the suburb has changed, because the Victorian suburbs, what many of us think of as the suburbs are probably the areas beyond where we live in London. But Mr. Pooter living in Holloway, but has that boundary for suburbs spread out as London has spread out? Were stories set in Bromley 100 years ago about the countryside and have now been sort of swallowed up by the city?
Yeah, definitely. So obviously the suburb moves further and further out as you go through the 19th century. And so lots of the places that people are writing about now, the inner city, which is really interesting. So you can see that definitions and instructions have changed and what constitutes the suburb. But at the same time, there's lots of suburban features. Like Bromley still feels quite suburban. If you go to Bromley, it feels like suburbia, whereas you go to Peckham, it doesn't feel like suburbia. So it's definitely a kind of, you can probably draw a map. Someone could cleverly draw a map out of these things. But there's definitely a sense where the suburbs start and the city ends. It just moved out quite a long way since the 1880s and 1890s.
Or is a suburb a state of mind? Maybe that's the.
I think it is, yeah.
Yeah.
So lots of these novels do explore, contemporary novels explore this idea of of this as boring as an end point and nothing happening, which is very old-fashioned view to have, really.
Well, and also I'm just wondering whether there's a sort of age perception on that. That younger novelists are going to think of the suburbs as dull, boring, and stultifying, whereas slightly older ones think of them as being much richer and slightly weirder than perhaps their children would.
I think the big shift also was the idea of migration in the 60s. So a lot of people from the Caribbean and from India moved into places like Brixton and Beckoning, Camberwell and Holloway and Southall, completely changed those places. So Brixton was traditionally a very boring suburb, very respectable. You can read about it in the 1880s and nothing ever. I think that's why Conan Doyle chose it, because it's a boring nowhere and nothing ever happened. Whereas now we don't think of Brixton like that at all. So I think in the late half 20th century, there's an idea of the suburbs completely turns around, becomes a place of great movement, great change, great churning populations, and changing again now, of course, because now Brixton's become hipster, and it's kind of going through that transition.
And yes, I guess you've got that overlaying of the of different ethnicities, so that suburbs now or areas in London are associated with different cultures, that gives them a different character. So whether it's Greeks or Kurds or Brazilians in different parts of London in different suburbs.
That's interesting, because what's interesting about that is that it's moving out to zones 3 and zones 4 and zone 5. So you get up almost on the barrows of waters of Essex. Now it's very sort of Eastern European, like things like Barking places, which is partly the result of the reason why such a big turn up for the Brexit vote, was all of a sudden there's people from Eastern Europe turning up, not in the suburbs, but in the outer suburbs. So there's a complete churn and change in the last 30, 40 years over what constitutes the suburbs, really. And all this has been written about. So it's kind of, it's out there if you look. People have recorded their impressions. So like Zadie Smith's NW, which is a much more pessimistic book than White Teeth, because it's about, people can't afford to live there, people have to move out, people are trapped, it's very claustrophobic because of the whole house price, superinflation. People can't afford to live in the former suburbs anymore anyway.
A few questions from the attendees. So Bart asks, are there any suburban documentaries or films that stand out for you?
I don't think. Not really. I like the Book of Suburbia, the film adaptation, which came out about 2000, I think, and then there's a film, but not really. There's all sort of partial things which you can see bits of suburb, but it's very few things. Remember films like by Mike Leigh or something like that. I'm still waiting for a great London Suburbs set film. Suburbs tend to be more in sitcoms, tend to be more in comedies. People just do nothing and stuff like this. It's kind of the sense of, again, it's the comedy. There's something really comic about suburbs and suburbia, which lend themselves more to sitcoms rather than kind of drama.
A bit like the Pooters and the Mr. and Mrs. Smith, whatever it was that you were talking about. That it's a subject for light comedy rather than great tragedy.
Even in modern sitcoms, they're sort of Pooteresque individuals who are out of place, who don't understand themselves, who've got no self-knowledge, got no self-awareness, kind of they fish out of water, rather than kind of serious dramas. I can't really think of any. I think some later. If anybody knows of any, they can let me know.
And David asks, what kind of vision of the suburbs do you think will emerge from the COVID period, where the local neighbourhoods have acquired more importance than they did? They're not places in the last year that we've been leaving. They've been places that we've been sort of rediscovering.
Well, exactly. So what I've been spending my time now, because my work's kind of disappeared slightly, I've been spending time exploring the suburbs. And it's interesting how little you know your own area. So you tend to go, if you live in a suburb as I do, I live in zone 2, zone 3, you just go to central London, come back. But spending walks, cycling around, there's so much more around the suburbs that you didn't know was there before. And also they kind of suburbs, I think they're going through a kind of renaissance anyway, really. People were priced out of central London and moving to zone 2 and zone 3 before the COVID thing struck. So I think that's going to continue and kind of develop and yeah, so I think it's kind of accelerating patterns that were there already. So
and
yeah.
Sorry, and Mel asking, I think it's possibly similar, or similar to things that we've been talking about. How do you think the suburbs have been changing in the past 20 years? There is that thing you were talking about, how different some of the suburbs now have got a buzz to them. You know, Peckham, for example, is edgy, if you'll forgive the expression.
Yeah, so Peckham's my kind of area, really, and I moved there in the 1990s, and there was nothing there. It could have been the 1890s. There was gradually happening. Incredible what's been happening in the suburbs in the last 20 years in terms of what you call it, really, hipsterification. You know, there's lots of bars, there's loads of microbreweries, there's loads of markets, loads of street food stores. So I think there's a huge change going on in the suburbs. They've been much whiter, they've been much more middle class, they're becoming much prettier, more acceptable, but also losing something as well. So again, so I think the whole thing is the suburbs never really consistently change all the time, and they're going through another stage now as populations are moved further and further out from the centre. So like I say, around here, it's completely been transformed since 2000, last 20 years. Peckham's almost unrecognisable. You know, they have bars and car parks that are now bars and open cinemas, and it's just unbelievable, really. You know, it's kind of the way gentrification has moved out of Islington and Camden, and it's just moved out into these inner suburbs. And where's everyone going to go? It's crazy. I have no idea. Another place it's quite near is Elephant and Castle. There's a place there called Elephant Park. It used to be a very tough kind of, I guess it's always a city, really, city suburb interface. It's now been completely transformed into high-end apartments and street markets and skyscrapers. But the people who live there have been decanted out into Kent and Essex, to much far-flung places, you know, so it's completely changed the suburbs that I know in the last 20 years.
Yeah, I mean, that was the topic, I suppose, of Robert Elms's Bannister Fletcher lecture, which you can still, for those of you in the audience, you can still see on the website. Cities need slums. That all of London is becoming too posh. There aren't any rough areas left or rough edges left to it if we're not careful.
Yeah, and you talk about therefore moving up from Nottingham, I think, to northwest London to the suburbs. And this is something that's been repeated on a much larger scale.
And a couple of final questions. One from Joe, who says you've had to read some bad books. Did you discover a previously forgotten masterpiece? Are the some that you've never heard of that you read and you thought, oh my God, someone this ought to be better known?
Yeah, a lot of the books were pretty terrible, but the comedies are actually really funny. So this guy Barry Payne, who writes the Eliza stories, they're really, really funny. And I hadn't read much of his stuff before, but actually, and sort of minor novels. Also things by Jerome K. Jerome. I hadn't read much of Jerome. I thought it was just sort of nonsense, really, but they're actually really witty and quite political. Because in Jerome K. Jerome, he talks about suburban characters who go on a silly boat trip. And everything's in it. It's actually quite radical because they meet lots of posh people and kind of scrap and fight. They're kind of like the future generation in the 1880s, 1890s. So they're kind of educated and they can read. And they wear these really loud blazers and with hats, and they just kind of make a nuisance of themselves. So it's lots of. I think you can read things quite differently. Even the Diary of a Nobody, I thought that'd be really quite boring and staid. It's actually quite radical as well. It's quite mischievous, and about snobbery and about class difference and about people being excluded and not being allowed to live a life that other people don't want to have. So sort of Barry Payne is quite interesting. Loads. Yeah, so once you start digging down, you do find things that you think you know and you don't really know them at all. P.G. Wodehouse has written he wrote some early stories about Smith with a P in the city, and that's set in Dulwich and Camberwell. It's hilarious. It's all about politics and political strife. So I think what I found is interesting novels that I didn't know were there, and also rereading novels differently because you know something more about the background and where they come from, which is about conflict and clans and snobbery and difference.
Which and one last question: do London suburbs differ from those of other large European cities?
I think so. Yeah, I think so because most people think that the modern suburb, as we understand it, started in London. Robert Fishman says in Bourgeois Utopia, so the first modern suburb is Clapham. So it's this idea of a house, the garden, the separation, the distance, the gap, and you don't get that so much in Europe. I don't want, I know Paris, bits of Berlin, but you don't get that kind of, we're going to move out of the city and we're going to live somewhere differently, and we're going to have a house with multiple rooms in the garden, and we're going to be separate and distinct. I think the whole formation really kicks off in London as a project rather than as a mistake or an error, or as I guess it became a sprawl eventually, but it's kind of like an ideal which you don't get. It's kind of cohesive, and so I think the suburbs have an identity around London that they don't have in other urban conglomerations. And states, so it takes off in the States. So American suburbs are kind of super British suburbs in that sort of sense, whereas European suburbs are very different, I think.
Well, fantastic. Thank you very much for that. I really enjoyed that, and I'm sure everyone else did. So thank you for giving your time. And the book, you can see there, All the Tiny Moments Blazing, a literary guide to suburban London. So published by Reaction Books. So hopefully the audience will be rushing out to buy copies before lockdown number 3 hits us, which may come next week. And just on suburbs, the London Society is helping put some work together on the suburban task force that's being done. So we will be publishing some findings from that, and having some events during 2021 on some of the findings from the suburban task force.
They had a meeting today, didn't they?
I think yes, they did. The all-party parliamentary group that we sponsor, which I should have been at and wasn't, but I will catch up on later. But yeah, there'll be more of that published during the year. So brilliant. Thank you very much. Thank you all in the audience for being there. Have a good Christmas. Keep our fingers crossed for some form of normality in 2021. On behalf of the Society, thanks very much, Jed, and hopefully speak soon.
Thank you very much. Bye, everyone. Bye.